Large turbot. Large turbot for the Berkeley Hotel. Tuna sold, Tuna all done at 90p. Thank you very much. Joe Forbes, 3 ones of ice, please. Pick out where you like.
Got any halibut, though?
No. What do you want to pay? 2.30, a couple of fish? All today's, caught yesterday. Caught off the stock. No, you've got the 2 biggest fish then. That tuna's sold, madam, I'm afraid.
The old Billingsgate fish market closed for the last time on January the 18th, 1982. The last prime site on the City of London's waterfront became available for redevelopment. From Tower Bridge to Blackfriars, the river's edge preserves 2,000 years of waterlogged archaeology. The closing of the Billingsgate market gave the Museum of London their long-awaited chance to excavate a major waterfront site. Since 1973, there have been 70 archaeological digs in the City of London. Some of the most important have been by the riverside and around London Bridge, where London began in Roman times. Billingsgate was to be the culmination of all these digs, for it was not only at the heart of Roman London, but known to be an important Saxon port in 1000 AD. This sectional drawing of the lorry park shows where the archaeologists planned to put their trench, right above the line of the Roman and Saxon waterfront. The trench was also expected to include the lines of successive waterfronts up to the 13th century. In a miniature of 1500, the market appears as a colonnaded building. And the same colonnades can be seen in a drawing made in 1555. At the end of the 16th century, they are still there. In 1616, Billingsgate was still London's major public quay downstream from London Bridge. The heart of the Billingsgate Inlet today lies under the 1875 market building. The lorry park to the west of it lies over the junction between Billingsgate and the wharves next door, and the dig was actually positioned to include St Botolph's wharf. A year's careful planning has already gone into this high-pressure, high-technology dig before work on site actually begins.
We've been on site since the middle of January, but the first few weeks of that time were spent by machines here removing the rubble from the foundations that were here, which were bombed during the war. So the archaeology didn't begin till towards the end of January, start of February. What we had expected to find was everything destroyed down to here. We've in fact found walls, which you can see in the background, standing to up to 2.5 meters high, and they represent the, we think anyway, the church that was here before the Great Fire of London in 1666, and the building that was built here following the church's destruction.
St Botolph's church lay only 75 yards southeast of where the Great Fire began, and it was among the first city churches to go up in flames. The scorch marks on the walls are still visible.
This evidence we have here fits very nicely with the documentary sources mentioning this area, which record that 2 years afterwards, a certain Josiah Childs had acquired the property, and because the church was in such bad condition following its destruction, he was allowed, in fact, to dismantle what remained and use the stones that he felt useful in his new building, and to use the rest for dumping on the east side of the church to make a new lane which would flank his new building. So there's a very close correspondence between the documentary sources and the specifics of what we've got surviving.
The City of London has allotted the archaeologists 10 months excavation time, while the sale of the £22.5 million site is completed. There is real hope that the excavation period will be extended, as the developers have not yet received planning permission. As time is short, money has to be spent to make fullest use of the resources available. It cost £81,000 to install sheet piling for a coffer dam, to make the sides of the excavation safe and to keep out water seepage at high tide. Heavy excavators have been hired to remove the rubble of the Victorian warehouses which were bombed in the Second World War. The site supervisor's task at this stage is to coordinate his team's work around the heavy machinery, without holding up the clearance operations. He also has to work out at what stage the real archaeology, the digging by hand over the whole of the site, will begin. Two porter cabins will house the excavation records and the computer. As the dig goes down and each level is recorded and removed, the cabins will gradually become fuller with plans and context descriptions for future analysis. Because the dig has extra finance from sponsors, the Museum of London can invest in computers for the first time. Kevin Flood is a pioneer of archaeological data analysis and has developed computer graphics for the Billingsgate dig.
It's useful because we can use the computer as a sort of a very sophisticated filing cabinet. So we can ask for the information to be reordered, output in a certain way so that it is formatted, looks nice for other people to read, and we can do statistics with it. And in the future, we will be able to not just compare one site, we'll be able to compare all the sites in London using the techniques we've used here.
It is now 3 months since the dig began.
We're more or less on schedule as far as we can tell at the present time. We've been removing 17th century levels in the main, and it's making significant progress, I think, so far. We're starting to get down to the pre-fire, pre-Great Fire levels on the site, almost across the whole of it now.
There are about 60 people working at Billingsgate. 35 are having their salaries paid by the Manpower Services Commission. There are 5 or 6 volunteers, and the rest are staff from the Museum of London. About 60 burials have been found under the floor of St Botolph's church. The people buried under the south aisle are some of the wealthy merchants and their families who endowed the church. But even in wealthy families, child mortality was very high in the 16th century. On this skeleton, it's possible to see the child's milk teeth and its delicate ribs. There are copper rivets decorating its coffin. Even the hair on its head has been preserved.
We have, running up through the middle of the site, a gravel metallings of the lane of St Botolph's, and running through up the middle of the lane is the cut for a very substantial drain, the evidence for which survives as a series of iron collars into which the wooden pipes of the drain would have been fitted, and associated with those collars are stone boulders which supported the actual joint. It's a feature which was in use immediately before the Great Fire of London, and it was draining water from side drains associated with the buildings flanking St Botolph's Lane down to the south into the Thames.
Some of the sponsors of the dig are given a special tour by Brian Hobley, the chief urban archaeologist.
As you know, we're putting your money not in the excavation proper, but in facilities for the general public to view the excavations. the visitors standing on the platform will be able to look down ultimately at the prime object of the excavation, which is of course to find the character of the 5th and 6th century, the Dark Age period of London, and look at the point where the Saxon boats could have docked.
I think it's fantastic.
Yes.
I mean, how high are your hopes? Now, what clues have you got from previous digs along the waterfront?
Very high indeed, as I expect Steve and others have explained. We have got a sealed level here at 1666. Apart from the cesspit there, which is 18th century, everything below these surfaces that you see is contained. They haven't been damaged by any late warehouse basementing or anything. So the potential is very great indeed.
Really.
Absolutely. We shall strip it off layer by layer, coming down. And of course the depth is going to be quite enormous. Potentially we could go down some 30 feet from the viewing platform. So the visitor will actually be able to look almost straight down and get a very vertical plan view of what is coming out.
This is one of the bottles that we found in the cesspit. As you can see, it's quite intact, quite a nice little bottle with a string neck. The string would go around the neck and a cork would be attached at the other end of the line. Through the dirt in the bottom, you can see the pontle mug. The pontle was a long tube of glass which was used in blowing the vessel. When the glass was finished, it was broken off and you get this characteristic indentation on the bottle, which actually helps a lot to stabilize the vessel.
The draftsmen in the find shed draw the most interesting objects from the site just as they look before restoration or treatment. This object is a coffin handle, and a drawing made by someone with a trained eye can bring out many more details than a photograph.
We've also been fortunate enough to find a rather lovely little gold ring. Which is quite intriguing. And on the inside it's marked in memoriam EI. The date seems to be the 7th of September or October 1673 or 1773. These rings were given out at funerals, and you frequently find that a person would leave, say, £100 in his will to have a certain number of in memoriam rings made up and distributed at his funeral, or sometimes even before his funeral.
In the summer heat, the site begins to resemble the more glamorous digs of the Mediterranean.
I'd like to talk about a finds recovery program which specifically aims at recovering textiles. Well, we've had a lot of textiles that have turned up in just sort of miscellaneous lumps of God type of thing. And then when they've been sorted through in the conservation, they've turned out to be quite nice fragments, like, for example, the silk. Came out of something like that. And the very, very coarse twill.
Textiles are mainly found in the moist dumps of earth behind and in front of the waterfronts. Some things are found by hand, but the most fragile textiles only emerge after the earth has been removed and sieved. The sunny atmosphere of the dig is clouded by the rumour that the developers are not going to extend the time beyond the end of November.
I think the thing that concerns me most is the pace at which we're possibly going to be doing the whole thing. I'm very worried that if we have to implement the contingency plan, we're not going to be able to recover finds and give them the sort of attention that we should be able to on the site, especially given the amount of planning that we've put into the whole process.
Certainly, I mean, it's going to be an archaeological disaster if we have to finish at that time and implement the contingency plan. In the long term, it's going to cut down all sorts of fields of research. And of course, the other side of all this is what it means for the actual people working here, because we're going to end up by asking them to work incredibly hard for the last 2 or 3 months of the excavation through to November to be working overtime, and then we're going to throw them out of work at the end of that. So what we'll be doing is effectively asking them to work extra hard in order to work themselves out of a job. Well, what I envisage, if we do have to finish by the end of November, is that we'll have to excavate the two halves of the site at radically different speeds. Basically, we're divided in two along this line here.
Yes.
And in the western half, we'll go through the medieval waterfront levels very quickly, aiming to record the major features in outline, until we get down to the Saxon Bank, at which point we'll have to go at a much slower speed. Then we'll excavate that carefully down to and through the late Roman quay. So on this western half, we'd then get a complete sequence.
Right.
On the eastern half of the site, we'll have to do something very different. We'll go through the medieval levels much more carefully, particularly with respect to finds retrieval, and we'll come down to the top of the Saxon Bank and investigate it in plan at the top in detail, but not actually have time to go through it.
So the contingency plan will entail the inconvenience of excavating the two sides of the dig out of phase. At a meeting in the Museum of London, the archaeologists put their case for an extension.
Billingsgate is the last chance we'll get on the waterfront in any major way. And there is so much of richness there, but only if we tease it out very, very carefully, or rather, not so much taking our time up, but with great measured care. And this means certain techniques from the waterfront dumps to retrieve the finds, in particular the small objects which, in previous excavations, we've lost through the speed that we've had to apply.
Perhaps the most eloquent arguments for allowing us to continue is exactly the nature of the Roman quay that we're dealing with. This is...
The dig's consultant engineer explains that it would be to the developers' benefit if they allow the archaeologists to remove the Roman timbers before they drill for the foundations of their office block. Developers on another site only 200 yards upriver had already come to grief.
That's on the other side of the street, and ours, of course, is on the south side of the street. But they're basically of this single monumental construction of oak, which is rock hard. It's 2,000 years old. And this is the kind of thing that they were taking out. They tried to probe with ordinary LC80s, and it was just a waste of time. And they eventually had to pull up the whole thing with great vigour and some mechanical problems.
We've talked to the client about this, and he indicated that there might be a possibility of extending into the early part of 1983.
Well,
he wasn't very specific, because it wasn't one of those days when you get
the first breakthrough that we've had in 8 months.
Yeah.
We've got to roll the programme as fast as we can, because there's such an upfront financial commitment that the interest charges are staggering for every month we're behind, and we must press on. I'm tempted to quote a figure, but it's probably $1 million a month at the end of the day, by the time we've got our full capital employed in terms of site and building.
The trouble is, you see, that archaeologically, every day while you are formulating your plans, for your own good reasons, nobody doubts that for a moment, but every day archaeologically, we are doing something quicker and more brutally and perhaps unnecessarily so, more than we would like.
Valuable archaeology is being lost every day,
and therefore,
while we have this crash program going through.
From our side, the sooner that deadline, whatever it is, 3 or 4 months, we can talk about, but whatever it is, the point is, at what point shall we be able to know that and plan for that extended day?
Now sooner than later. I mean, giving us an extension
We are not
beyond...
going to let that site, that archaeological site, stand idle without you working on it, as long as we don't need it.
Splendid. That's the intent that we wanted from you.
On the east of the site, there are 13th century merchants' buildings. Extra people are working here now with tremendous speed and concentration. 10 weeks have passed, and there is still no definite news of an extension beyond November. The wattle consolidation in front of a 12th century waterfront is being put on plan. It will also be described on a context sheet and given a context number. Each person is responsible for putting onto the computer the information about the contexts which they have excavated. The descriptive language has been standardized for the computer program.
Charcoal. Occasional fine riff.
I've got some good news. We've all been waiting for many weeks for this extension from the developers, and I heard yesterday morning, in fact, that we're okay. We should be going on beyond the end of November, and we will not be asked to leave the site before the end of January, and possibly we should be going into February and March as well. So that's very good news.
Paul Lashmar from The Observer, one of the sponsors.
So what was happening last time you were here?
Well, the St Botolph church was, you just cleared that, and it was a very nice structure, but I see you've moved it all out of the way now.
Yeah,
so.
well below that. Well, let me explain what's coming soon, as it were. Basically, underneath here, running away from us, we'll find the late Roman quay. The level of it is underneath these wailings that we put in. And then one interesting thing is behind it, we should be getting the contemporary ground surface. So not just a quay in isolation, but potentially some of the features behind it, running from here right the way up to the north. So,
well, you'll be particularly pleased because the extension will allow you to get at the Saxon and the Roman now.
Certainly, yes. I mean, this is a particularly vital area for us. The Saxon bank dipping that way and dipping that way, running diagonally across the side, is the critical question. So now we'll have time to get there properly and do it justice, as we'd always hoped.
Well, you were hoping that this would reveal whether the Saxons were actually very active in London during the 5th and 6th centuries.
Yes, well, or if that early, yes. What we will have is evidence for their occupation down right to the top of that bank.
A cross-section shows the way the Roman quay decayed and silted up before the Saxon bank was built. On the west of the dig, there are 3 successive waterfronts visible from the Saxon period onwards.
So along here you can see the lines of the successive reclamations after the Saxon period. The line of the Saxon bank is roughly where the chap in white is standing. It then gets moved from that position out to the line immediately running from here. These structural elements I'll show you in a moment. And then sometime in the late 12th century, it's pushed forward again from this position right out to the extreme south of the site to where the chap's working down there. In fact, the timber that you see down there is the base of the late 12th century reclamation. So here we've got one of the revetments in detail.
Marvellous timbers, aren't they?
Yes, quite amazing. This is 12th century, sometime during the 12th century, probably early 12th century. There you have the foreshore that was there before they reclaimed the land. Then they put this base plate on top. You see the timber right down the bottom. And then all the vertical members are jointed into it. And then these braces at the front serve to hold it up. So you've got the vertical members, you've got the braces bracing the front of it. And then the area behind was cladded with these horizontal planks that you see sticking out at the back. And that formed the actual front of the waterfront. Then all of this material was dumped against it, and the building was built on top. So you'd have a structure up there, and you'd have the Thames all the way across here.
Many of the wharf structures are built of reused timbers. Gustav Milne, of the Department of Urban Archaeology, realized that one wharf in particular had been made of a dismantled house, and he has managed to put together the wooden wall and 2 uprights of an 11th or 12th century stave and plank building. This is a remarkable find. For houses like this never survive on dry land sites.
Right, Chris, shall we see if we can put this in the building? You got it? Come on. Easy. All right.
Okay. Perfect.
Good, isn't it? Even got the peg this end.
During the excavation, the vast proportion of the waterfront dumps have been removed from the site and put into separately identified heaps in order to undergo 2 kinds of fines retrieval, metal detection and sieving. At first, 25% of this organic matter was sieved, but as time runs short, only 10%. The sieve with the 1 centimetre mesh is for finding the larger organic remains, like textiles and leather, which survive because of the damp conditions. The 1 millimetre mesh sieve is for the environmental finds, which are smaller objects like pips and seeds, which, when identified under a microscope, will reveal a great deal about the trees and plants of the river bank, and even the diet of the people who lived there. There are only 2 months to go before the end of the dig. The £8,000 roof has been up since October as protection from the winter weather.
So we've got the Saxon Bank pretty well exposed over the western half of the site now. It's timber lacing with clay infill packed around it so that the function of the timber is to hold together the clay and consolidate the ground to form a beach area. The grooved plank on the southern side of the bank actually forms part of the revetment, holding it back, stopping it slipping into the Thames, so it's like the front of the bank. Difficult to define, but it's probably 9th or 10th century. We're trying on the western half to extend at the level of the Saxon Bank so that we can expose it as a single entity running the full width of the site. But because of the contingency plan in operation before, we'd gone rather faster on the western side and we're still in the process of catching up in the east. But our intention is to try and get them into phase when we reach the top of the Saxon Bank across the full width.
Since the viewing platform was opened in June, nearly 20,000 people have seen the dig. They come at the rate of several hundred a day, especially in the city lunch hour. On the parapet there is a plan showing St Botolph's Lane to orientate them as they look down on the excavation. In the northeast corner, the team has just reached the revetment, which was built as an extension to the quay in the 12th century. The organic levels, which accumulated in front of this revetment during its lifetime, are being recorded. And when these levels have been drawn, they will be removed. The dig is now 6 feet below the present level of high tide on the Thames. The 12th century revetment is 3 or 4 feet below the gravel of St Botolph's wharf, which was excavated here back in July.
Well, to tell you the truth, I've over-excavated, and it's all his fault because he told me to hurry up, so I dug a lot out, you see.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Right, I mean, this comes off to the organic layer. The organic layer then...
We plan that,
yeah.
Plan and level. And then we
with that
off.
Okay. We can do that in a day?
We can do it in 5 minutes if you want. No wish.
Okay. Well, in that case, here, which is obviously later now 6283, does this post actually touch the planking behind it?
It's quite difficult to tell whether it does. I think it actually does touch the top piece of cladding there. Minimal 6205.
The elements of the late 12th century quay, which have already been removed from the site, are being transferred into the recording systems of the excavation.
Now, what do we want
Any
there?
wedge?
Wedge, yeah, 6259.
6259.
And base plate 6258.
6258.
Each element of the quay has been given a context number, and these numbers are being put onto a matrix, a master plan, in the order in which the quay was originally constructed.
And peg, yeah, 6257.
Got it.
And secondary base plate 6256. No associated pile. Right.
The crucial point in the dig has now been reached. The removal of the Saxon bank has revealed the Roman quay. A little further south are the collapsed remains of the Saxon revetment for the bank, which is surprisingly substantial. The pottery from the Saxon layers is being washed and recorded, so it can be analysed. This is what is going to provide the exact dating for the structures which have been found on the site. There is just enough time left to find out the relationship between the Saxon quay and its Roman predecessor.
2.5 weeks to go. How are we doing for people?
Well, people are okay.
Can you pack any more in?
No, well, you can see it's pretty well full.
It's okay.
No, I think we'll just about be all right. This area, certainly, we're just coming to the siltings.
Yep.
By Sunday, we'll have those siltings out of the way.
Yep.
So that leaves us 2 weeks to get through the robbing, the dumping behind the quay, and the specifics of the quay itself.
Yep.
Only 6 days to go before the whole site is to be cleared before the developers say they will move in. The stones of St Botolph's church, which Josiah Childs reused to build his house after the fire of London, are taken away for storage.
This is very interesting because you've got the rib positions through their pegs.
Yeah.
There. So it's got the spacing of the ribs. It's obviously a repair of some sort there. And you say, what's the dating? 10th? Should be 10th?
Probably 10th
century. Yeah. Marvellous. So it should be about contemporary with the Gravely boats. It's nice. Very nice indeed.
This plank is rare evidence for a small Saxon trading vessel. The only previous example was found in the Thames mud at Graveney in 1970. On the east side of the excavation, there is an inlet, where boats like these would have tied up to unload. At this stage, as the Saxon bank is cleared and time runs out, the spoil is not removed but dumped at the far end of the trench. But excavation is just as careful and reveals a piece of pottery stamped with a Christian symbol. The timbers, which form part of the reinforcement of the Saxon bank, are given context numbers before being removed. The environmental samples will be stored, and their secrets only unlocked, when they are analysed in several years' time. A little to the east of the present London Bridge, the Romans built their first bridge across the Thames nearly 2,000 years ago. London became the headquarters of the Roman occupation of Britain, a vital port for the exchange of goods with the rest of the Roman Empire. At Billingsgate, after 12 months of rapid and skillful excavation, the massive timbers of the Roman quay are finally exposed. The museum has come back, 2 weeks after the agreed end of the dig, to complete the photography and remove the Roman timbers.
Yes, I did. They might have forgotten them.
There is, as yet, no sign of the developers. On the east of the dig, time for careful removal of the Saxon timbers has run out. A small section of the timber is cut out for tree ring analysis. This will indicate when the Romans felled the oak trees from which the quay is made. They probably chose trees growing near the Thames and had the timber floated downriver.
What's the number on it now?
3 metres of the quayside are going to be preserved for the proposed Dockland Museum. In the conservation laboratories, the fruits of the careful fines recovery systems are being investigated. The textiles from Billingsgate are proving to be especially interesting. Modern chemical analysis will eventually even be able to tell what colour these little scraps of cloth once were. The stitch size is being measured to find out what type of cloth this fragment is. But for the last 2 months, the site of the excavation has been standing idle. The archaeologists feel that they could have used this time for more detailed excavations, while the contractors did their preliminary work on the rest of the lorry park. They are also disappointed that they could not negotiate a watching brief to be on site, while the remains of the Billingsgate quaysides of the 14th century onwards were shattered by the contractors' heavy machinery. There are years of work to be done on the post-excavation analysis of the finds. Billingsgate was a rescue dig, but it was always part of the programme to have a research project for assessing the validity of various archaeological techniques. Now there are no more funds for extra staff and no more money from the Department of the Environment. How much of the research project can be salvaged in this situation?
Material that come from an ecclesiastical part of the site or whatever. And then lastly, there's the business about our recovery systems. I mean, we've gone to all this trouble of doing the sieving, doing the metal detecting, putting the sieving through various mesh sizes, etc. And it would be very nice to compare the effects of that different recovery system, those different recovery systems for each type of artefact, to see whether it's been worthwhile, and if so, for what type of artefacts it has been worthwhile.
We do have this feeling in the Finds Department, and as it were, the public at large behind them and the Department of Environment, that they would like to see the best finds brought out and shown fairly early on. Do you think, obviously what you're suggesting is saying, hold on, we do it slow, we do it more carefully, but do you think that maybe do you think that these easier defined groups that you mentioned are maybe those that can be brought out in advance of the others?
Well, certainly they can be.
Certainly with the cesspit and the culvert groups and things like that.
Right.
But you're right that there is a slight conflict between what Steve's proposing and what perhaps the stated priorities of the
Yeah, the problem is if you can have some, not interim publications, but you can bring the groups out, they are the priming of the machine that produces funds for next year.
The main thing about the finds from Billingsgate, surely, is that they're from a controlled excavation. Now, we do, of course, get things which are seemingly important as artefacts in their own right at the time, but the reason we've done Billingsgate is because we've got them in association with other artefacts in a well-controlled situation, right? Now, if we're to make proper use of that, we have to analyse correctly the relationship that they have with the site. And before we can do that, we have to have worked out what was happening on the site. So, of course, we can go off and publish something in isolation, but then it might as well just be an object that came up from the foreshore, really, for all the good it does us. We want to know the relationship between that find and Billingsgate as a site, as a preliminary to knowing how useful it is elsewhere. And this is the only way of doing that.
One of the most valuable finds at Billingsgate was a Saxon halfpenny from the reign of King Edgar. It was a unique find, but its true value to the dig was that its association with the Saxon inlet gave the Saxon waterfront a date which had to be later than 959 AD. Before datable objects like the halfpenny are used as evidence, the matrix must be completed by putting onto it the context numbers of the last few recorded layers that were excavated on the site. Stephen Roskins will then begin to work out the whole sequence of periods and activities on the site from the relationships recorded on the matrix, starting from the Roman period at the bottom and ending with the 17th and 18th centuries at the top. After 6 months of working through the contexts on the matrix, the team have reached the 14th century.
Right, next one is...
Working from the bottom upwards, each context is read out and then placed on the appropriate phase plan.
It's got occasional flecks of charcoal and it's loosely compacted. But hang on, it says C context 3000 at the bottom. First of a series of layers which curve sharply upwards on their eastern side. All the layers are very thin.
Definitely a make-up layer. What that probably means is that the north-south division down here was kept in use after the demolition of this building.
Yeah, that sounds fair enough.
So anyway, we can put it into 17D as part of the make-up for this new surface.
The excavation and physical deconstruction of the site took a year. Its chronological reconstruction will also be taking a whole year.
And it's 3066.
3066, that's right.
I've already completed this process for the earlier parts of the sequence, and as a result of it, I've been able to generate a series of period plans showing what the site was like through the centuries from the 3rd to the 11th. And here is an example, for instance, of its appearance in the Roman period. I've managed to put together certain aspects of the line of the quay here and correlate them with further elements further to the east to give an overall picture of what it was like at that time.
The earliest feature for which there is evidence is the Roman quay built in about 220 AD. It was of the same construction as the Roman quay built on the river at Xanten in Germany a few decades earlier. This is a model. When the Romans completed the defences of London in the late 3rd century by building a wall along the Thames, the quay fell out of use. Stephen Roskins suspected that at Billingsgate there was in fact a gate in this riverside wall, but he could not excavate it because it lies under Thames Street, beyond the northernmost limit of the dig. So he had to use the more subtle evidence of the shape of the silting to suggest some kind of access point. His hypothesis was that the Roman quay was robbed, sometime during the Roman period, to give access to a gate in the wall. The curve of the silting suggests a channel leading towards the gate. And when the Saxons came to build their quay, the inlet seems to be positioned to take advantage of this same access point.
I imagine a ruined or a partly ruinous defensive wall, no longer manned by Roman soldiers or anyone else, which was gradually falling into decay, but which still stood well above ground and would have restricted access from the river into the settlement as a whole, and therefore carried on, influenced an access point.
On the find side, Alan Vince has been able to analyse the bulk pottery in an astonishing 6 months, and is coming up with adjustments to the dating of the first quay on the site, known to be later than 959 AD, but how much later?
As I understand it, you've got a bank in here with timber lacing or struts inside the bank, is that right?
Yes.
And then you've got this revetment here, which had to be held back into the bank in order to stand up. Now, we've looked at the pottery from this in some detail. This is the breakdown of all of the context and the types of pottery, which we've weighed, each type separately. And it seems that there's a very sharp difference between those with the 6,000 context numbers, which are those within the bank here, and those with the 7,000 and later numbers, which seem to be all found in front of the revetment inside this inlet there, and in front of it here on the foreshore. And the difference in date is, as far as I can see, it's as much as a century, which could mean that this material here is much closer to 1100 than 1000, which would make it a Norman bank rather than a Saxon bank, if the two go together. These are the types of pottery that we find. Well, they're not the actual sherds, but that sort of part's found in the bank. Then here's your first revetment, fallen over, flat. Right. We've got pottery from underneath it. And then immediately above it, you had a gravel layer, which produced something like 6 lead trial pieces for coins. I think we've got one there. Because I think these coins can't have been deposited any later than about 1090. And the pottery that's associated with them and that's in the foreshore above is very, very similar to the material that's immediately below them and is stratified underneath your collapsed revetment, which suggests to me that the Saxon bank, or at least that revetment, may actually be a Norman bank.
So I must go back with these particular context numbers and look again at this position of this accumulations in front, these foreshore accumulations in front of the quay, and see if they really are accumulating during the lifetime of that quay or afterwards. And I suppose if it turns out to be the case that I stand by those original decisions, the ultimate solution to this will come with the dendrochronological dates that we'll get. It's a shame that I'll have to wait 2 years to solve it, but
yeah, especially when there's only 3 or 4 pieces of wood that we're dealing with.
Yes.
Whether the timbers of the first quay were put in before or after 1066 does not affect the date of the Saxon bank itself, nor does it affect the conclusive evidence that Billingsgate has given us about the Dark Ages in London.
Billingsgate gives us some solid evidence, really, to suggest that there is this considerable gap between the Roman period and the Saxon town, and that this is important. It isn't just that there is flimsy evidence which doesn't survive, it is actually that there is discontinuity, that the form of the Roman town was radically different from the Saxon town.
After the 10th century, the waterfronts moved forward as demand for land increased. By the 13th century, the site was divided into 2 by St Botolph's Lane. On the east side, there was a public keep, and on the west, churchland, with St Botolph's Church reaching its greatest size just before the Great Fire.
St Botolph is the patron saint of travellers, and of course we know from other St Botolph churches in the City of London that they all lie adjacent to gates, in those instances landward gates. But for Billingsgate there wasn't any such explanation until this excavation, when we can now begin to postulate on archaeological evidence the existence of a gate, which makes sense of the positioning of St Botolph as being another St Botolph's Church near to, in this case, a water gate.
The destruction of the unrecorded archaeology continues. The building development means that the archaeologists have had time to discover only half the secrets of this, the last major open site on the London waterfront. But perhaps they will discover a little more. On January the 11th, 1984, the developers finally agreed to grant the Museum of London a watching brief. In this way, some of the remaining archaeology will be recorded.
Of 3 distinguished archaeologists.